This hearing will come to order. We want to welcome everybody to the Committee on the Budget. And we have today on our agenda a hearing focusing on how to make budget enforcement more effective. Over the past several weeks, this committee has held hearings focused on different aspects of our effort to reform the congressional budget process. Budget enforcement, the subject of today's hearing, has been a part of the discussion from the very beginning. And the reason is obvious. A budget that isn't enforced is not effective. Moreover, the budget process Congress ultimately adopts will only be successful if Congress is willing to enforce the budgets that we approve. So this is a two-part discussion. We need to determine what rules and limits we believe are reasonable and worth adopting and maintaining. At the same time, we have to determine how we will force Congress through both Republican and Democratic leadership to abide by those rules and limits. The current process is not without enforcement mechanisms. You could even argue that they are too numerous to be effective, or at the very least too confusing and too disjointed. At the congressional level, we have the Congressional Budget Act itself, which prescribes certain enforcement tools. In addition, we have the annual budget resolution that, when adopted, provides for additional enforcement mechanisms. And we have the rules of the House that members vote on each Congress. In law, there is PAYGO, which has the unfortunate effect of making current debt or deficit levels seem okay, so long as we don't add to them. And the current Budget Control Act caps on discretionary spending, coupled with sequestration, which have proven to be problematic in their own right, each trading thoughtful budgeting prioritization for across-the-board cuts that treat almost all government spending as equal and worthwhile. One of the more troubling aspects of the current budget enforcement environment is how easy it is to waive budget protocols, often with little or no recognition by members of Congress themselves that we are agreeing to violate our own rules. This is a chronic problem. Again, both parties have been subject to the challenges, and it undermines the integrity of the process as a whole. While we can all imagine instances where it might be reasonable to expect Congress might need flexibility to temporarily forego certain restrictions, we all should be able to agree that it should be a lot harder and less convenient than it currently is for Congress to expand its own rules. In the absence of a truly effective budget enforcement system, Congress has spent decades adopting and often discarding various avenues to control spending, whether it be the super committee or the occasional attempts at a grand bargain, continuing resolutions in lieu of the regular appropriations process, or the aforementioned sequestration. Just to name a few, Congress has tried and largely failed to create consistency and coherency in its budget enforcement efforts. What's worse, too often, policymakers have sought to shift our responsibility for enforcing spending discipline to the Washington regulatory regime. Nowhere has this been more prevalent than in the mandatory spending side of the ledger, namely the Medicare program, which is the Starship. You'll remember how the now discarded sustainable growth rate formula that was meant to tamp down on the growth in federal health care spending instead simply succeeded in threatening access to health care for America's seniors. Thanks to the current health care law, we have the Independent Payment Advisory Board, or the IPAB, a board of unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats tasked with saving money by denying payment for and thus access to health care services for seniors. If Congress is willing to have a rational and realistic conversation about the nation's fiscal challenges, there's no need to hand over control of tough decision-making to the regulators. In fact, that sort of structure only weakens Congress's power of the purse as prescribed in our Constitution, and it diminishes the role of the budget in the broader legislative process. Ultimately, to strengthen our budget enforcement, we must streamline and make coherent the rules by which we choose to govern our fiscal well-being. We need to make a violation of those rules, whether or not it is the will of the majority of Congress, much more transparent and obvious so that policymakers will hold themselves, us, accountable and be held accountable by the American people. Such a structure would hopefully make a waiver of our rules the exception and not the norm as currently exists. To discuss these important issues and where we go from here, we have three witnesses today, folks who've been around budgets and budgeting for a long, long time. I don't think we could have a finer panel of expertise before us. Bill Hoagland, Senior Vice President at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Richard Kogan, Senior Fellow at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. and Barry Anderson, who's been working on budgets for years and years and now is an independent consultant. We want to thank you all for being part of this discussion. We welcome you and look forward to your testimony and the conversation that will follow. I'm pleased to recognize Mr. Van Hollen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join the chairman in welcoming all our experts. None of you are strangers to this committee or these issues, so thank you all for being here. And just on behalf of my colleagues, the Democratic caucus is going to be hearing from Secretary Clinton. She probably just arrived, so that's why a lot of our colleagues are not here at this time. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding these hearings. I would say that I think the consensus of most people who follow these budget issues closely is that while there may be some changes that could be made to the budget process is not what is preventing the United States Congress from moving forward on fundamental budget questions. We have agreement in this committee that we have long-term budget challenges, but the budget process is not what's going to get us there. It's not the budget process that prevented our Republican colleagues from getting a budget this year. It was the fact that a number of members in Mr. Chairman, your caucus did not want to abide by the discretionary caps that were agreed to just last November by Speaker Boehner and embraced by the current Speaker, Paul Ryan. This committee was able to get the budget out of here, but the reason it's not come to the floor has nothing to do with budget process. It has to do with the fact that votes weren't there to uphold the agreement that was put in place just last fall. We've also seen through the appropriations bills a misuse of the OCO account, something this committee and the previous chairman of this committee said in numerous committee reports was simply a backdoor way to undermine the budget process. And that reflected an unwillingness of members to stick with the defense caps, but a desire to spend more in other areas. So those are just a couple of examples of this year. So I do think it's putting the cart before the horse a little bit to talk about enforcing budgets when the major impediment to achieving budgets has been the lack of political will. I also, Mr. Chairman, would just caution against talking about this hearing in terms of budget process when, in fact, there are really some substantive issues that are on the table, like putting in place a cap on mandatory spending. That is really a fundamental substantive issue. It can be put under the guise of process, but I would just point out that we have in place right now, or did, a number of provisions to prevent the deficit increasing by reducing revenues coming in. The chairman mentioned the pay-go rule. We have a statutory pay-go rule. The chairman described that as being somehow wrong because it accepts, quote, the status quo of current deficits. The pay-go rule was put in place to prevent deficits from getting worse, and we have another very recent example of just blowing through that statute last year when the Congress passed $600 billion in additional tax cuts, $600 billion added to the deficit over 10 years. And if you look at that bill, it waived the statutory pay-go, not a rule of the House. It was in statute. Said don't add these costs to the statutory pay-go card. So I think really what we're seeing here is a desire to get rid of rules that were designed to prevent increases in the deficit through tax cuts, even though the Congressional Budget Office tells us that the single biggest annual category of expenditures are tax expenditures. And in each of those cases, we could have offset the increase in the deficit from those tax cuts by getting rid of some of those tax expenditures. But the decision made was to get rid of that rule that would have prevented deficit increases. So it just goes back to the fact, Mr. Chairman, if we're going to really reduce our long-term deficits, we have to do it in a balanced way. You're not going to be able to sort of tip the playing field by saying we're going to cap Social Security or cap Medicare, but we're not going to deal with the revenue side of the equation. And that has been one of the major impediments to achieving progress in this area for a very, very long time. So I hope we get into some of those issues. And again, I welcome our witnesses here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hoagland, Mr. Kogan, Mr. Anderson, I want to thank you again for your time today. We welcome you to the Budget Committee. The committee has received your written statements, and they will be made part of the formal record. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. And Mr. Hoagland, you may begin when you're ready. Mr. Hoagland, you want to turn your mic on there? Sometimes you have to press it down for holding.
Oh, got it. Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Van Hollen and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee. Be honest with you, I feel a little strange to be out here in front of the dais instead of back there with the staff as I did for those so many years in the Senate. At the outset, let me reiterate what so many of others have stated before this committee over the years, and that no process changes will make your decisions any easier. Budgeting is governing, and governing is challenging. But I do truly believe if political leaders want to find agreement on a federal budget resolution, one that is enforceable and address the fiscal challenges confronting the country, it is possible. Unfortunately, over the last several years, my sense is that budget resolutions have become simple extensions of a political party's platform agenda. In order to make the budget resolution meaningful and implementable, we must move from the party platform mentality to a governing platform. This does not mean elected officials must give up their strongly felt political positions, but it does mean that if budget resolutions are to once again actually impact final spending and revenues, changes need to be made. A couple of thoughts on what those changes might be. First, I understand and concur with the concerns of many Budget Committee members who feel marginalized because they are only brought into the decision-making process, if at all, at the end of the year rather than at the beginning. Restoring the committee's rightful legislative role at the beginning of the process is essential. Of course, having an agreement between the House and Senate at the beginning of the year does not guarantee that the President will sign the legislation that emanates from the Congressional resolution at the end of the year. Not having the early involvement of the executive branch in the Congressional branch's deliberations early has led some to recommend that the budget resolution should be converted into a joint resolution. Now, I have some concerns about converting the entire budget resolution into law. But I do see some merit in having the President and the executive branch included as more active and direct participants in deliberations about the congressional budget. One possible alternative to converting the entire resolution into law would be to convert portions of the resolution into law. This could be accomplished by building on agreements recently negotiated with the White House to set specific appropriation spending caps, but to reverse the order so that the budget committees and the two chambers agree on a set of parameters up front, not at the end. I would envision this working as follows. Legislation would be enacted that specifies the exact language of a mini joint resolution, a template, if you like, and 13 specific numbers, usually appearing in Title I of the resolution as recommended levels and amounts. These 13 numbers would be automatically placed in the template, enrolled as a joint resolution that is deemed to have passed and sent to the President for signature or veto. It would not be subject to amendment or further action. Those 13 recommended amounts would be discretionary spending for defense, non-defense for the current and the fiscal budget year, mandatory spending caps for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid for the current year and the fiscal year, revenue estimates for the current year and the fiscal year, and statutory debt limit for the fiscal year. With the concurrent resolution, while the concurrent resolution would continue to present numbers for the required 5 years or more, initially the enrolled mini joint resolution would be limited to just 2 years. The executive branch would now have a reason to be directly involved in the budget resolution negotiations. Indeed, one could further specify that if the President did not submit an executive budget by the statutory deadline, there would be no opportunity for a spin-off of the mini joint resolution. Upon the President's signature, the Congress would have officially set in law the major fiscal parameters for the current year and the budget year. If enacted, the aggregate numbers would be enforceable as under current law, appropriations through sequesters. For selected major entitlement programs, similar sequester mechanisms would be in place if Congress failed to enact legislation to meet the agreed-to targets. And for revenues, failure to reach the specified revenue ceiling through legislation would require an automatic increase across the board in rates sufficient to achieve the resolution's estimate. If signed by the President, regular order would require committees of jurisdiction to be in compliance with a mini joint resolution by enacting substantive law, or in the absence of such law, programs would confront automatic sequester procedures that I've outlined. This approach would directly involve the executive branch up front and early in the process, while enhancing the role of the budget committees in setting and enforcing the outcome. Obviously, if the President were to veto the mini joint resolution and the veto not overridden, the underlying concurrent budget resolution would remain in effect. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I've sketched out one proposal that I assure can be improved, but if the goals are to make the committee and the budget resolution relevant to the actual decision-making process and to engage the executive branch at the beginning of the process rather than at the end, then I believe this proposal might have help achieve some of that goal.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Kogan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Van Hollen, I'm always happy to come home to the Budget Committee. I'd like to make 2 points today. One is what I think the Congress can do in the way of budget enforcement, and one is what I think it should not do. There's no mystery to enforcing congressional budget plans. Points of order bar legislation that costs too much, and the reconciliation process can compel reluctant committees to submit legislation raising taxes or cutting the costs of mandatory programs. History shows that reconciliation has been used frequently and well. Some of the most important deficit reduction measures have been enacted through reconciliation. Specifically, the reconciliation process was first used in 1980. Since then, 21 sets of reconciliation directives have led to enactment of 17 reconciliation bills, the veto of 4 others. 2 of those reconciliation bills in 1993 and 2005 were approved in the Senate by votes of 51 to 50, with the vice presidents breaking the ties, fast track in the Senate. Of the 17 enacted reconciliation bills, 15 reduced projected deficits. At least 13 of the enacted reconciliation bills included provisions that generated savings in Medicare, suggesting that the contention that Congress has no ability to address permanent open-ended entitlements is not correct. Using the congressional budget process, I think, is a virtue. Entitlement caps of any form would be a truly bad idea. Caps would destroy the countercyclical aspect of these programs, immiserating millions of people when times are bad, harming their prospects into the future. The virtue of countercyclical benefit programs is mirrored by the virtue of countercyclical tax law. It is a good thing, not a bad thing, that revenues fall even faster than the economy during bad times and rise even faster than the economy during good times. Together, the countercyclical aspects of taxes and mandatory benefits serve to moderate booms and busts, make recessions less frequent and shallower, and contribute to higher long-term economic growth. Imposing an exogenous cap on mandatory programs would be as wrong-headed as imposing an exogenous floor on revenues, forcing automatic tax increases when times are bad. Would you display figure 1, please? It is a gross oversimplification to believe that mandatory programs are irretrievably out of control and therefore caps are a necessary evil. Putting aside for the moment Social Security and the major healthcare entitlements, the entire remaining set of mandatory programs cost now about the same thing as they have on average over the last 40 years, and according to CBO, those costs are not projected to rise. By definition, that means that these programs put no upward pressure on long-term budget sustainability. As figure 2 shows, only a minority of these mandatory programs are directed towards low and moderate income households, and they're not rising either as a share of GDP. The story is different, of course, for Social Security and the major health entitlements, as the chairman pointed out. As a whole, this set of programs is growing faster than the economy and does put upward pressure on budget sustainability. The question is what to do about that. For Social Security, the story is the aging population. Major health entitlements are projected to grow not just for that reason, but also because the nation and world keep inventing better medical practices that cost more. But the situation is noticeably less dire than it was 6 years ago. Figure 3 shows that the costs of major health entitlements are projected to grow more slowly than was previously thought. In 2010, the combined costs of Medicare and Medicaid were projected to grow from 5% of GDP to 11% by 2040. Now, however, the cost of Medicare and expanded Medicaid and the new health care subsidies and health reform are projected to total only 8% of GDP in 2040. The question with respect to Social Security and these health entitlements are the same. Should their benefits be reduced? Should their costs instead be covered by higher revenues? Should they be covered by reductions in other programs? And if so, which ones? If the best answer is some combination, what combination? The answer is a policy call. It's inherently wrong to say that either Social Security and health care entitlements as a whole should be capped, or that all entitlements as a whole should be capped.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Ron Holland, for having me here. I have submitted my testimony for the record. I'd like to summarize it. Unlike my colleagues on the right, I've never been on the other side of the table. I've always been on this side, so I find it very comfortable to be over here. I have 3 points to make. First is to emphasize long-term budget projections. Second, the necessity to extend caps to entitlement programs and broaden the current caps on tax expenditures. And third, to establish a new Budget Concepts Commission. The first is to emphasize long-term projections. We do not have a short-term budget problem, despite budget deficits of 400 or 500 billion or whatever that is, and even growing deficits. We can borrow as much as we can, and pretty much at the lowest interest rates ever. We have a long-term problem. And the short-term solution, the fact that we have very low interest rates to borrow money now, shouldn't be taken for granted that it's going to last forever. A good portion of this isn't just the actions of the Fed, it's actions around the world. The problems of other borrowers make us look good, and we continue to look good no matter how much how close our current unstable budget is going to be. So what we have to do is look at the long term. And when you look at the long term, the president submits a long-term projections, but they're buried in an auxiliary budget document well into the back of it. And I would recommend to the committee that long-term projections be part of the budget resolution and be emphasized in the president's budget. That's my first recommendation. My second, we now have caps on discretionary programs. But looking at the international experience, the countries with the most success follow a formula that goes something along like these lines. They set up a goal. The goal could be deficits, it could be debt, it could be a balanced budget, it could be debt as a percent of GDP, it could be debt in absolute amounts. They set up a goal. Then they look at capping spending annually or periodically in order to get the goal. And when I say capping spending, let me be clear. There are 3 categories of spending. There's discretionary spending, which we have caps now. There's mandatory spending, which we don't have caps. And there are tax expenditures, which is spending hiding on the other side. A little recognized fact is that we currently cap tax expenditures. I'm not saying it's a favor of it. I'm not saying it's a good one. But there are a variety of ways, including the PEAS limitation and the alternative minimum tax, that cap tax expenditures now. They don't cover all tax expenditures. They may not be a good mechanism, but they can be built on to cover tax expenditures. What we don't cap now is those major entitlement programs that grow. That is Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Those are the 3 that are forcing growth. Capping those, in some sense, would force the kind of political decisions that need to be made. And by the way, let me emphasize that by capping those, you do not exacerbate cyclicality. The counter-cyclical, the automatic stabilizer programs, as was mentioned previously, are primarily the SNAP program, the TANF program, and unemployment insurance. One need not cap those, and therefore you have a balance between the automatic stabilizers on the entitlement side and the automatic stabilizers on the revenue side. But if you look at those capping the mandatory programs as a way to promote force decisions, as well as capping the entitlement programs and as capping the tax expenditure programs, and then enforce them through an annual mechanism to reach the caps, the goals that you want. That is what's been proven to be the most effective way in a variety of countries, but particularly Sweden. And I mentioned Sweden because they faced a problem like ours 20 years ago, although it was actually worse for their economy. And they did entitlement caps, and they have been able to work relatively effectively for the past 20 years. The third point I want to make is to establish a new Budget Concepts Commission. There was budget concepts underlie the government's budget are in disarray. And my prime example of that is I was privileged to serve both as the senior career official at OMB and as the acting deputy director at CBO. And now looking at my two former agencies and seeing OMB and CBO disagree on the handling of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And we're not talking a few billions of dollars, we're talking trillions of dollars. It's just that we need to have this fixed. It shouldn't be up to CBO and OMB on how to fix it. It should be done by a presidential commission. There are other differences in the scope of the budget, defining spending and revenue, and the economic impact of different types of spending. But there are enough issues to go back and relook at the President's report of budget concepts of 1967 and redo it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thanks to all for your comments and your perspective, and I found all of the prepared statements that are obviously in the record to be remarkably enlightening, and I appreciate the work that you put in to trying to bring greater information to the committee. I have been struck by the number of enforcement rules that we seem to have in place for the budget, and yet we seem to not be able to enforce a budget. Now, the two sides of that, as Mr. Van Hollen mentioned, you got to get a budget done, and both Republican and Democratic majorities have had challenges with that. It's an equal opportunity challenge. And then once you get a budget done, then staying with that budget. And we have, in the Congress, again through both Republican and Democratic majorities, have seen time and time again where the rules are waived, the points of order are waived, on and on and on and on, so that we have extreme difficulty ourselves sticking to what we believe from a majoritarian standpoint to be the best path forward. So, Mr. Hoagland, I would ask you, I mentioned that we've got rules in law, we've got rules in the resolution, we've got rules in just House rules. Do you sense that there are any of those that are more effective than than the others, or which do you think are most helpful for us to concentrate on if we were to try to expand or provide teeth?
Just as a sidebar, let me say that for some reason, I still carry around all the Budget Act points of order in my pocket here, and from time to time I find it's about as thick as the Constitution of the United States. Yeah. As a staffer, I felt that we had far too many points of order that we placed in budget resolutions. I think the most effective way of having a points of order are those that are placed in law itself. Now, you've just mentioned, though, in your opening statement that they can all be waived by your rules, but I do think the most effective way of enforcement is through statutory regulations and laws.
Should it be a supermajority of the House to waive them?
In the United States Senate, where I spent my career, most of the points of order were 60-vote points of order for waiver. I should not comment on the rules and procedures of the House of Representatives.
But was that a good thing or a bad thing in the Senate?
I think it was a good thing.
Good thing. Mr. Anderson, same issue. We've got all these mechanisms of enforcement, and yet we seem not to be able to enforce anything. Do you have any sense about which is the best avenue to proceed if we were to provide greater teeth?
I'm sorry, but I guess I sort of disagree with the premise in the terms of not being able to enforce anything. The rules are there to provide incentives and provide motivation. Are they waived sometimes? Yeah. Are they waived maybe all too often? Perhaps. But the rules are there not to decide the factor. The rules are there to force the action on the part of the Congress, both the Senate and the House. So I think having the rules, whether they be caps or sequesters or pay-go or that type of thing, have actually been remarkably effective, particularly if you take it over a longer period of time. So I am a believer that the rules provide the incentives, and the incentives are the right ones even when they are waived.
So you wouldn't have any sense that a supermajority would be appropriate to waive any of these rules?
No, looking at it from an outsider, as I said, OMB and CBO and GAO, the supermajority in the Senate and other supermajorities, that's a hurdle for them to get by. No, I don't think that they're necessary.
I know there's a disagreement on whether or not we ought to cap mandatory spending, and obviously spending on the mandatory side is the one that is causing the greatest challenge from a fiscal soundness policy for the federal government right now. And I know you're a strong proponent of that, Mr. Anderson. But is there, if we were to bring mandatory spending on budget, if you will, if we were to have it be something that's reviewed annually or biannually, is there any, does that help mitigate the problem if we're looking at this with much greater frequency so that caps might not be necessary?
I certainly don't think it hurts. Does it help mitigate the problem? Perhaps some. But again, I talked about the value and enforcement mechanism as an incentive. And facing a sequester, facing a cap, is what I think has been by far the most important incentive.
Mr. Hoagland, same question. You encouraged all items to be on budget. Do you think that is an intermediate step to potentially capping mandatory spending?
I think it's an intermediate step. I'm not a fan of caps per se. I think they are a guide to force action. As the ranking member pointed out, capping entitlement programs, I think, is difficult. I've had unpleasant work over the years of dealing with health care programs. They are very difficult to cap as they are. It requires a lot of work. I think it's better to go into the program itself and adjust the parameters, have the authorizing committees deal with the specific changes. But to your specific question, I guess I would answer that if there is some way to force the action of changing the program, the entitlement program, in a way that would accomplish its goals of staying within a spending limit, I think that's better than just outright caps.
Well, let me pick up on that because I think that's the key. Obviously, we've spent decades looking at a projection, and especially Medicare and Social Security. This is the most predictable fiscal challenge that we've ever had, I would suggest. But we seem to have been incapable, again through both Republican and Democratic majorities, to solve the challenge so that we can say to beneficiaries, this is going to be there for you when you reach the age of being able to take advantage of it, something that you have paid into. We can't say that to them right now. So if we're going to try to incentivize the policy side of it, what mechanism is there to do that other than the goodwill and offices of the members of Congress?
I don't have a good answer for you on that other than to suggest that I believe this morning we'll have the release of the Social Security Trustees report. The Social Security Trustees report is going to point out, I presume, that in 2034 we're going to have about a 24% reduction in Social Security benefits for those what they thought were scheduled. There ought to be a way for Congress to communicate to the American public that the particular entitlement programs of Social Security, even Medicare Trust Fund A, are on a financing situation that is not sustainable. There ought to be a way that you ought to be able to communicate to the American public that these programs have to be changed in the near term, or else there are going to be significant reductions in the future. And to do that, I can only suggest that that's the role of you as elected officials to communicate to your constituents that these programs are unsustainable in their current form. How you do that, I'll leave that to you as and your constituent.
We've been challenged here at the Budget Committee to try to do that just because of the activities that we see in general from Congress, and I oftentimes tell folks unsustainable. Everybody uses the word unsustainable on both sides of the aisle. We say it's unsustainable, and I'd like to tell folks unsustainable means it will not be sustained, which means it's not going to happen. And so the Budget Committee has put forward a project called Restoring the Trust for All Generations, which is, to get to your point, Mr. Hoagland, to try to get the American people to appreciate that regardless of whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, these challenges are not going away, and we need the critical mass as a nation to solve them. So hopefully we're having a little effect in that. Mr. Anderson, if you will, opine about the incentives that the budget process or that any process that we might be able to adopt would force us to act in a way to solve these challenges before it gets to the point where we have to tell Mr. and Mrs. Senior in this country that they won't be able to get their full Medicare or Social Security benefits?
Sure. I look at the much derided and disliked discretionary caps as an example. I'm a believer and proponent of caps, as I said, but I'm also a believer and proponent of caps as an incentive for action, not as the final result. It was my job during the end of the Reagan, throughout Bush Senior, and into the Clinton administration as the senior career official at OMB to implement the variety of sequesters that were done in the 80s and 90s. And so I was basically on the line telling the agencies and their program officials on how to implement the various different cuts. That's not the way to go about doing it. But the more we did that, the more incentive there was to the Congress and the President to come up with an alternative. So with respect to the mandatory area, I like the idea, I've been a proponent of putting a cap on it and saying you don't want Barry Anderson or his successors to come around on October the 1st or whatever the date is and do an across-the-board sequester. That's not the way to do it. That is an inferior solution. Instead, you want to do, as my friend Mr. Hoagland just said, you want to take a look at the details of it, and you create this disadvantageous mechanism to provide the incentive.
Thank you. I thank you all for your responses. Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for your testimony. I just want to emphasize one of the points I made in my opening statement, which is we are living right now with a situation where we had an agreement capping discretionary spending at certain levels. The agreement was put in place just last November, and this Congress has been unable to stick with that. That was the equivalent of a biannual budget for discretionary spending, what a lot of members have called for. But we haven't been able to stick with a cap on just one portion of our budget, discretionary, and get and move forward. So I really think that the testimony we've heard is very helpful, but I think it again illuminates the fact that a lot of these issues come down to fundamental policy choices. You know, we talked about Social Security. Social Security, you know, we're facing a situation with an aging population. People talk about Social Security in the context of this hearing in terms of having to cap benefits, but obviously there's a major debate raging about lifting the cap on payroll taxes. We've got people who have put forward proposals that CBO will tell you will deal with it right away on the revenue side. It just gets back, Mr. Chairman, to the fundamental issue here, which are the choices we have to make as a Congress with respect to both spending and the revenue side of the equation. I was also, Mr. Kogan pointed out that we actually have made some progress, significant progress with respect to at least projected healthcare costs. If you could just expand a little bit on that, because that was a change made. It was made through some of it through the Affordable Care Act, and that was a reconciliation process.
Mr. Van Hollen, Figure 3 showed that the projected costs of health care, there you go, are considerably lower now than they were before. It also shows, however, that the projected costs are still rising as a share of GDP, and the rest of the budget isn't falling fast enough to cover both them and Social Security. And that's why we all agree that there is a long-run challenge and that legislation will eventually have to be enacted, and if it could be designed sooner, that would be better, because it would then phase in more slowly. It would be easier for everybody to deal with. Nonetheless, this change from the top line to the bottom line in a mere 6 years is really significant. It knocked 1.5 percentage points off the fiscal gap. Basically, it cut the fiscal gap, as CBO had projected it, more than in half. Part of this is due to the Affordable Care Act, which, through a variety of mechanisms that induced hospitals and physicians to change their behavior one way or another, have moderated to some extent the cost growth in health care. Part of it, however, preceded the Affordable Care Act and cannot be attributed to it. And neither CBO nor anybody else I know of is able to disentangle which factor is greater and which factor is lesser. It is nonetheless the case that repealing the Affordable Care Act, as some people have voted to do, would very likely, while it would decrease the cost of health care by removing 20 million people from the health care rolls, leaving them uninsured, it might also have the effect of allowing hospitals and physicians to work the system the way they did before in a way that caused costs to rise more rapidly. There's no easy solution to this, as both of my colleagues have said, and it really is better if Congress wants to do it, to do what you did in the first 10 years in which reconciliation was used. In 8 of those 10 years, reconciliation bills were enacted. Every single one of those reconciliation bills included congressionally designed restraint in Medicare costs. This is doable.
Right.
9 out of the 10 of those years, it was done when either the House and Senate were of different parties or Congress and the President were of different parties. And that's really the issue. If compromising with the other side is immoral, then this won't work.
Right. I think that that's exactly right. I mean, that's the fundamental issue, and I think there's probably broad agreement on that point. With respect to putting in place supermajority requirements, as was in, the reconciliation process itself, because of the way it applies to the Senate, actually puts in place a majority requirement in the Senate with the 51 votes instead of having to overcome the 60 hurdle. I do have concerns about supermajority requirements binding future Congresses and binding, in fact, the American people to what is a undemocratic process, small d. I know one of the earlier hearings talked about the power of Congress being eroded in this process. I think that kind of requirement that binds future Congresses would have that impact. I understand the attraction with it in some ways, but there are also the downsides. Mr. Anderson, if I could just ask you, because on the tax expenditure side, I'm trying to better understand what you're saying. We have tax policies, certainly like the Ps, that phase out, the value of certain deductions at higher income levels. But I mean, that's individual tax policy in the code. I mean, we have in Social Security, we have a law that also says, if you work this long for this many years, you're getting this much and no more. And some people have proposed changing that, right? Increasing the benefit, sometimes just for lower income people. So what you're saying with respect to tax expenditures applies with respect to our individual tax policy. We do not have in place an aggregate sort of cap, right, on tax expenditures per year. We don't say on a particular year, if revenues don't hit a certain level, we will have an automatic, tax increase of some kind that's written in the law. And that actually has been an issue that's been discussed in many of these past, the Biden Commission, the so-called super committee, to try to address these issues. Because of a lack of desire on one side to have that kind of revenue stabilizer, we put in place the sequester that applies both to defense and non-defense. And we can't even stick with that on the defense side. Do you have any models from other countries? I don't know if Sweden, with respect to an aggregate sort of trigger with respect to revenues, take into account Mr. Kogan's point that it would not be a good idea to have one in times the economy was, was going down. We don't want tax increases or, in my view, those big spending cuts.
Thank you. No, we're the leader in the world in terms of tax expenditures. We have many, many more than other countries and have had them for longer, and they're much more complicated. No, they don't have tax expenditure limits, but then again, other countries don't have the depth of tax expenditures that we do. But with respect to the similarity between what we're doing now and what we could do across the board, let's just take the P's limitation, the limitation that is on Schedule A. It was the decision of Congress some years ago to put a limitation on it. Then it expired, and then it was brought back in 2013. With respect to a cap on that, one can take a look at that cap, which, as you correctly point out, you total them all up and then you take a haircut at certain levels of income and change that, either the levels of income which applies or the haircut that applies, in anticipation of trying to reach some future goal. The same way that you put a cap on discretionary spending or could put a cap on mandatory spending. We don't do that now. You're right. Now it's what it is what it is, and you can do it. But the mechanism is there to basically essentially provide a cap to tax expenditures. Now, I'm not in favor necessarily of just the P's limitation. Why? Because the tax expenditures listed on Schedule A aren't even the biggest tax expenditures, and it avoids lots of important ones. But one could broaden that and use that as a mechanism to say there are really three different kinds of spending: discretionary, mandatory, and tax expenditures. And we don't want to avoid any of them. But one of the things I'd point out is if you use that mechanism, then you don't inhibit the countercyclical nature of the taxes. The countercyclical nature isn't in terms of limiting tax expenditures. It's playing with the rates, or as was mentioned earlier, with the floors on taxes. And that would be detrimental, as was pointed out earlier.
Thank you. No, I think you're making a good point. It's a tax policy discussion, really, that goes with health policy discussion. I mean, for example, the president in his budgets has proposed a tax policy change that says for higher income earners, you're limited to, you don't get your full 35% deduction, you get 28% deduction. That's a form of limiting tax expenditure, so to speak. So I think that's got to be an important part of the conversation. I would just suggest that it's a policy argument on the tax side, just like we need the policy argument on the others.
Gentleman's time has expired. Vice Chairman of the committee, Mr. Rokita, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman for holding this series of hearings that continue to enlighten us and members, and that I think the subject matter is long overdue. I also thank the witnesses for their testimony today. As I heard you speak, I'm thinking about other members of the House who sat in those chairs right there and presented very good ideas on a range of issues. Some of them, or actually a majority of them, about controlling spending. Ideas such as fiscal goals, balanced budget amendments, and limiting debt to a certain percentage of GDP. In addition to members, David Walker actually focused a lot of his testimony on limiting debt to a certain percentage of GDP. So I guess my question first is, would it be possible to accomplish this being limiting debt to a certain percentage of GDP, assuming we wanted to do that? Would it be possible to do it through a House rule, a statute, or do you need a constitutional change? Mr. Hoagland.
I don't think you could do this through a House rule. I mean, maybe you could have a House rule that says only in the House you only consider legislation that doesn't exceed a certain percentage of debt to GDP. But as it relates to implementing that particular provision, I think that you'd almost have to have a statute to actually accomplish that goal. Let me also say, this is, for those of us who have been at this, labored in these vineyards for an awful long time, this is not a new concept. This has been around for a long time.
The idea of
limiting the debt to a percentage of GDP. And it always runs into a little bit of a problem with explaining this to quite frankly, to the American public. They understand a number. They don't exactly understand a percentage of a GDP figure.
Yeah, well,
it's always a lot easier.
The explanation will come in the result when they see the debt stabilize.
And I think that's great, but it's a number. I would go back to, I think one of the suggestions I had was in the mini joint resolution was that when you adopt that, when you adopt your budget resolution, you had a debt limit number in here, and that debt limit number was translated. You had a GDP number in here also. So you could have enforced that particular number in your budget resolution, by simply having
Thank you, yet we didn't. That goes to my question. So we had, not a signed into law statute, but we had something like that. And so if we had a constitutional change instead, Mr. Anderson, would that be better, or would it be just as unenforceable? And that leads to a second question: who would enforce it? The courts, and they kind of stay out of our business. But if you had a constitutional change, would that?
I've had the privilege to work a long time at OMB and with White House counsel of various different administrations, both Republican and Democrat, and I am not a lawyer, but they have consistently said that one of the benefits of the U.S. budget process is that it generally doesn't go to the judicial branch, that almost all the decisions are out. I've learned to appreciate that more and more the more I've traveled internationally, where they have too many of the decisions going to the judicial branches of country. I say that because I think a statute is a far better way to go about doing it than an amendment.
So I appreciate that. I'm going to have to skip you, Mr. Kogan, on that particular point, but it goes to my third question, and that is, there's a lot of states who have already signed off on having a constitutional convention around this very idea, something similar. In fact, we're a handful of states away from having a constitutional convention for the first time in our history, I believe. What's your thought about that?
Well, I just left the National Governors Association, so, and given my long experience in the federal government, this came up in a number of different states. The question is that the Constitutional Convention is wide open. What subjects it takes on is not defined. And
My
so,
interpretation is from the press, the media account, that states have all agreed to limit the convention. Are you saying that they can't?
oh, I think they can. I think that their opportunity, but I don't believe they have articulated what those limits are yet.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Yarmouth, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the testimony of the witnesses. Just a couple comments first. In talking about Social Security, and there's this, I think, common refrain, and that is that Congress doesn't have the courage to deal with Social Security and the long-term budgetary impacts. And I would suggest an alternative argument, and that is Congress is actually being very responsive to what the public wants. Virtually every time the public is polled on whether they want Social Security benefits reduced, 75 to 80% of the people say no, they don't want it. And so I suggest that really what we're doing and what Congresses have been doing over the past several decades is just to reflect what the American people believe. And it's understandable why they would believe that when 2/3 of Social Security beneficiaries derive at least half of their income from Social Security and 1/3 derive their entire income from it. So I think this is why we have a difference in terms of the national discussion. We have our presumptive nominee, Secretary Clinton, talking about possibly expanding Social Security benefits, and the other side talking about curtailing them. You know, this is the third hearing that I've sat through now on process, and one of the things that kind of concerns me is that most of the discussion has been on the expenditure side. How do we stop how do we either curtail any increase in spending, or how do we reduce the spending we're doing? And if you're talking about enforcement, if you look at the revenue side, you also have to deal with how we enforce our revenue laws, and the fact that our main enforcement mechanism is the Internal Revenue Service, and the Internal Revenue Service has been degraded by successive Congresses who refused to fund it adequately, and that we now have hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of fewer agents actually trying to attract the revenue that the taxpayers are due. So I suggest that when we talk about enforcement, we look at enforcement on the revenue side as well. But I do want to talk about particularly healthcare spending, and I know that finally, supposedly the majority is going to release its alternative healthcare plan that's been promising for 6 years now, but it's going to be, instead of an actual piece of legislation, it's going to be a white paper that calls, among other things, for per capita caps on Medicaid spending. Now, in my state, out of a population of 4.4 million, we have 1 million plus citizens who are receiving their health care by Medicaid. So, Mr. Kogan, could you talk about what the impact on my citizens in Kentucky and others throughout the country would be by per capita cap? I'm not exactly sure what that means, but any kind of cap on Medicaid spending.
Any type of cap on Medicaid spending is less desirable than the current system in which Medicaid pays the cost of actual health care that is needed when it is needed. The people who have Medicaid don't have the same freedom as Medicare patients to go to any doctor. They can only go to those who accept Medicaid. And states can put Medicaid patients into HMOs, which some citizens feel are less desirable. But as compared with not having health insurance, Medicaid is a fine program. Medicaid costs per beneficiary and based on health status far less than Medicare, which in turn costs about as much as or less than private sector health care. So the problem is not that there's any design flaw with Medicaid. The problem is that health care is expensive. Okay, now, given that, if you cap Medicaid, it's possible, in any form, it's possible that you could push down provider reimbursements a bit more. But my fear is that if you pushed it down much more than it already is, and each state pushes as much as it feels it can, that physicians and hospitals will simply stop taking Medicaid patients. There's no law that compels them.
Right. One quick question regarding EITC. If we cap mandatory spending on EITC and we refuse to raise the minimum wage at the federal level, aren't those policy choices where the cap on a program actually just forces more pressure on states or on the private sector? It really doesn't do much in terms of solving any human problem.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Renacci, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses for being here. I actually thank the chairman for this process. I think it's good that we continue to talk about processes where we can work together for the American people, because this is an issue. I've heard the word unsustainable a number of times. It's interesting. For the last 5 years, first off, I got to tell you, I was a business owner for 3 decades and a mayor who had to balance a budget. The first place we started was a good financial statement. You had to have a good financial statement, and everybody who was part of the process had to understand it. So one of the issues I have is that we get this 400-page report from the Treasury, and it's posted on a GAO website, and most members of Congress, including myself, couldn't understand it if you printed it off, which I've done. So one of the things that I've attempted to do, and actually we're going to drop a bill this week, a bipartisan bill. There's approximately 20 members, 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats, requiring the Comptroller General to come before the House and Senate and do a joint session discussing the unsustainable financial position of the United States. And I think that's a first starting point. I want to ask some of you your thoughts on that. But on the reverse side, we also have a budget, and we talk about this. I don't care whether the top line's 1040, 1070, I don't care what it is. The problem is we establish a budget, and then we break the budget, and we have legislation ongoing that breaks the budget. And I can tell you that our staff here at the Budget Committee estimates during the 114th Congress, budget rules alone were waived 42 times. These waivers are given blanket protection. There's no specificity in the underlying resolution on which to call for a vote. Moreover, the rule itself is privileged. Thus, absent defeating the previous question or the rule itself, no amendments to it are in order. Therefore, a House member is stripped of the opportunity to ensure all fellow members that the House is considering a budget-breaking legislation and putting colleagues on the record as to whether they want to proceed with that legislation. There's a couple bills last year that I've mentioned in previous hearings. The Cures Act was a great example. The Cures Act broke the budget, yet most people said, no, it was paid for. So when you ask people on the floor, did you realize you're voting for something that breaks the budget? They said, no, it was paid for. Well, it broke the budget, which was one of the problems. So I've actually dropped a bill already in March, the Budget Enforcement Awareness Resolution, that would restore members that opportunity. It requires the Rules Committee to specify each budget-related point of order that they are waiving as part of the rule. It makes the rule subject to a narrowly written method by which the rule may be amended through offering a privileged motion to amend the provision with the budget-related points of order, and requires 20 minutes of debate and vote on the motion. It's a requirement where members would have to understand they're breaking the budget. So in the real world, which I came from, you set a budget, and then you had to live with the budget. So I know I heard Mr. Anderson, I heard you say that the rules are good. I agree the rules are good, but when you waive the rules, which we do, are they good, or should we live with the rules? What is your thoughts on the resolution that I've discussed, which will require debate on any time we break the rules?
I really liked how you introduced the subject, saying you were a business owner and that. I've had a long career in budgeting, and one of my successes in budgeting was being able to handle the complexity of it. But the more I've handled the complexity, the more I've really thought that the benefit, one thing we ought to do more of budgeting is make it simple so that not just you and the budget committee, but the public can understand it. The president used to do something called the budget in brief, or the Citizen's Guide to the Budget. They took the 2,000 pages and boiled it down to 25 that people could understand. That got stopped a number of years ago. I think it ought to be brought back. I would suggest that you not only bring the Comptroller General here, but you ask the OMB Director to reestablish the Citizen's Guide to Budget so that you and the committee and your citizens, your voters, can understand what's in the budget.
That is important. Mr. Kogan or Mr. Hoagland, you have any thoughts on either of those resolutions?
I would just like to totally second what Barry said about the Citizen's Guide to the Budget. It was a wonderful document. It managed to make complicated things relatively transparent. When I served at OMB, I tried to persuade them to reinstate it. Go for it.
And I concur with my colleagues here on the dais. Also, I just say, as it relates to the GAO in terms of the financial statement of the United States government, I think that is a very complicated document. I agree with you. I've been through that document myself. I do think there ought to be a way in which you can bring that document more into the general discussion of the budget, and having the GAO comptroller testify would be a good idea. I would also suggest something that Mr. Anderson stated in his testimony that might help you a little bit with the GAO and OMB, and that is to bring back the President's Commission on Budget Concepts. I think it is important that last time we had one was 1967, and I challenge members, let alone even staff, to describe the difference between offsetting receipts and offsetting collections. There are so many issues that need to be resolved and better understood and cleaned up that I think that it would be helpful to do something like that.
Time has expired. Mr. McDermott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask a little bit broader question than we're focused on at the moment on health care. The Republicans are about to roll out their alternative to ACA, essentially repealing it and moving to a premium support kind of program and more shifted cost onto individuals in terms of out-of-pocket costs. Now, I've been studying healthcare budgets for a long time, and the only way to control healthcare costs is with a global budget, which is what they do in Germany and in France and a lot of other places, where they say, this is what we're going to spend on healthcare this year, and we're going to give a guaranteed set of benefits during this year, and then next year we'll renegotiate with the medical profession on the prices we're going to pay in the hospitals and everything else. When I started in Congress in 1988, we were spending GDP-wise on health care something around 12 or 13%, and everybody showed a graph that was going up to 25% and said we have to do something about Medicare, because Medicare was the problem. And it's clear to me that the free enterprise system has been running the healthcare system in this country with no controls on it, because we don't put controls on it. We don't even have a price list in Medicare what we'll pay or what should be the cost. So I have a hard time understanding how getting rid of federal health care programs is going to ever control costs in the health care arena. It seems to me that I sat in a hearing in Germany where they were negotiating the price on appendectomies. And they said, we expect to have 1,000 next year, and we're going to pay $1,000 a piece, so we'll set $1 million aside, and that'll pay for the appendectomy. Somebody said, well, what if we have 1,200? They said, well, we'll reduce the payment to $800 to stay within our $1 million cap. And then we'll negotiate next year a new price with a new number about how many appendectomies. I don't see any way to control healthcare costs in this country without having the government deeply involved in setting the controls on prices. Now, I'd like to hear your response to that assertion. Mr. Kogan, why don't you start?
Certainly, I agree with you that a single-payer universal health care system would allow more downward pressure on prices. Whether that's desirable or not, whether that downward pressure is desirable or not, is a political question. As a budgetary question, obviously, downward pressure on prices would help system-wide. It would be a bigger cost for the federal government because it would be a unified one, a smaller costs for individuals.
In terms of the GDP?
Yes, it would, instead of being at 17% of GDP and rising, it might be frozen at 17% of GDP or only rise to 18 or so on. But even in Europe, as you well know, their costs as a percentage of GDP are also rising. And so if we manage to freeze ours, theirs would eventually catch up to ours. The reality is that healthcare is expensive because it performs life-saving goods that people strongly desire, that individuals have no way of judging the quality of the health care that they get, even after the fact, and that this puts us in the difficult position that you're talking about, where there's going to be a lot of government intervention if we want to restrain the costs, or if we don't, those costs are going to keep going up and up and up, and will be borne by citizens one way or the other.
The proposal that the Republicans are rolling out talks about it be a personally driven healthcare system. Do you think that patients will be able to make the judgments to control costs? Say, I'm going to have a baby. Which doctor delivers cheapest babies in town, and I'll go to that doctor? Those kind of, I mean, like buying a refrigerator. Is that the kind of thing you think will happen?
I don't know whether it'll happen, but whether it happens or not, I don't think that can happen well. Individual choices on which doctors, which hospitals, which plans, I don't see how that can work.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. McClintock, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My grandmother, who passed away in 1995, once told me she didn't think we were going to get our health care costs under control until we went back to a system where the doctor looked the patient in the eye as he handed them the bill. But Mr. Anderson, I'd like to start on your response to Mr. Renace's point. It reminded me a little of the story of Churchill's first cable when he was named First Lord of the Admiralty at the outset of the war. It read, First Lord to First Sea Lord, pray tell me this day on one side of a single sheet of paper what are this ministry's plans for winning the war. Cicero said that the best laws are the simple laws. Have you given thought to what would be a simple and practical budgeting process? Just stepping aside from this huge bureaucratic mess that we've assembled over the years. We were to sweep all that aside and start over. What would it look like?
First of all, with respect to your introductory statement, I was at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris for 5 years, and I had my health care covered there. And their system, which was just mentioned before, is the second most costly in the world when you take it. But one thing you do on that system is you make an automatic €25 payment directly to the physician right after your thing. And they have a cash machine right outside the office to make sure that you have it. With respect to simplicity, I have continued to be impressed that what we do here in the federal government, we make so incredibly complex that it is almost ununderstandable. We have, again, using my international experience, perhaps the most transparent budget system in the world. But we also have the most complex, and complexity trumps transparency every time. So I like to start off with the kitchen table. By that I mean, let's start with the mother and the father sitting down and talking about their budget and how they would go about doing a budget. We do have something they don't. That is, we can print these little things called dollar bills. But other than that, there's actually, I think, far more similarities than there are differences.
Well,
And
if
if you
I could-
start there, then I think you can continue.
If I could, well, and that starts with the Congress enacting a budget. When we do that, though, we've been pretty good over the years, with or without a budget, controlling our discretionary spending. We brought it down about $400 million over the past 5 years. The problem is the mandatory spending is exploding on us and making a mockery of any savings that we effect on the discretionary side. Now, you've got about $2 trillion, out of the roughly $4 trillion we spend, you've got $2 trillion that are trust funds. That's a self-contained system. I mean, it's a big problem. They run out of money, benefits drop dramatically, but strictly speaking, that's not a budget issue. The discretionary is about $1 trillion. That we've done a pretty good job controlling. The mandatory non-trust fund is another $1 trillion, and that's what's out of control. What I've suggested is simply changing the system a little bit so that the House enacts budget levels for both discretionary and mandatory spending. The Appropriations Committee then allocates the discretionary spending according to those budget numbers, but at the same time, and this would be the change, the authorizing committees then recommend statutory adjustments to conform to the mandatory spending levels established by the budget. Those are then sent to the Appropriations Committee and placed in the appropriate appropriations bills. And then the savings and the spending provisions are taken to the House floor as individual bills. And by that I mean, in the relevant appropriations bill, both the statutory changes to reduce mandatory spending as well as the discretionary allocations by appropriations are in the same bill. Would that be an improvement?
I definitely think it would be. I started off in response to an earlier question highlighting what I think is the success of caps as incentives in order to reach better policy decisions.
Budget is caps.
And that's right. And what you just described, as I understand, I've just heard it here, I haven't studied it, is that kind of incentive to provide the incentive to Congress to take the specific actions to reach a target, to reach a cap, to reach a budget.
Mr. Hoagland, your opinion?
The simplification that's maybe heresy to suggest this is the collapsing of the authorizing and appropriation committees into one committee.
That's also been suggested, and I think that that's a very good idea. Let me just touch on one final point, and that's unauthorized appropriations. About a third of our discretionary spending is now for unauthorized programs that lapsed many years ago. Is that a good idea to review these programs periodically? Should we start enforcing the House rule that says that we should only appropriate for purposes authorized by law?
Gentleman's time has expired. You can nod or say one word.
Yes.
Thank
Good
you.
answer.
The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hoagland, in your testimony, you include a report from the Bipartisan Policy Center by former Senator Pete Domenici and Alice Rivlin. Dr. Rivlin served under Presidents Johnson and Clinton. One of the suggestions in the report is that the budget process should include all federal spending and revenues. It should not leave entitlement spending or tax expenditures on automatic pilot as they are now. A lot of times any constraint on entitlement spending is attacked by the left, as we've heard today. Yet this suggestion comes from someone who worked for 2 Democrat presidents. Was the director of CBO and deputy director of OMB. Would you briefly explain some of the reasoning behind her support?
Dr. Rivlin, I'm not sure I can speak for her directly, but we were involved directly in those discussions in the production of that particular document, which we have submitted to the committee for its inclusion in this testimony. And to be honest with you, my discussions with Dr. Rivlin from the outset was that she had come to the conclusion on her own and that the only way to force action on these entitlement programs was to bring them all in together, including tax expenditures, including revenues, and put it all under one major cap and to set it. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't waive the cap, as I know we do from time to time with other programs around it, but her position has become very strong, even as a Democratic leader in Clinton administration and the first CBO director, that you have to put some limits on this and put a target out there and live within the target.
It sounds like that it's really being irresponsible for us not to address this in a sensible manner, to face the reality of the unfunded liabilities that we have, in addition to the underfunding of Social Security that we're going to deal with. I think it's about $13 trillion coming up over the next 10 years. That's 75% of GDP. We're talking about the growth of spending GDP. So it would be irresponsible for us not to address it. Would you agree?
I agree 100%. Could I, Congressman, if you'd allow me, could I respond to Mr. Yarmouth? I understand that the American public out there and the person who's receiving Social Security today wants status quo. I think most proposals that are on the table say for those particular people who are currently receiving Social Security that they should not worry. But I want to point out, we've been having this discussion for a good 20 years, and we knew this was coming. Whatever that trustee's report says this morning, it's probably going to say that within 18 years. Let me just remind everybody that within 18 years, if you retired at 62, you will be faced with, when you're 80, a 23% reduction. This is not an issue that can be delayed any further. We have to address this going forward.
Since he responded to Mr. Yarmouth, I reclaim that time, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, Con.
Anyway,
I didn't realize the rules. I apologize.
well, that's perfectly okay. And your answer, I appreciate your answer. And the point, though, is that we're still in a period where we can do something about this. There's no time to panic, as I tell people, there's always time for that later. But we can solve this. The federal government addressed this back in the 80s with the reform of the federal retirement system. There's a way to do this. Now, I want to transition a little bit here and talk about, Mr. McClintock got on the unauthorized, but there's also the issue of the failure to collect all the taxes that are owed. I think the IRS admits that there's about $400 billion a year that they don't collect. In our 10-year window, that's $4 trillion. We have improper payments going out at the tune somewhere between about $110 billion a year. That's another $1.1 trillion. In addition, though, we have revenues that are unappropriated that the agencies receive. And I just would like your perspective on this in terms of a responsible budget and us exercising our Article I authority over all revenues. Should we require that all revenues go to the Treasury subject to being appropriated by Congress and that be taken into account in the budget process? Mr. Hoagland.
Yes, but let me just qualify my yes with this comment. As the tax code has become more and more complicated, my first suggestion is to simplify, streamline, eliminate a number of the tax expenditures. I began my career in this town many, many years ago as a GS9 in the Department of Agriculture. I will simply say that as we have these discretionary caps that limit salaries, expenses to those particular agencies, IRS is one of them. I do think they do need resources to carry out a complex tax code.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, just point out that the IRS has the resources. It's a matter of how they spend those resources. And one of the issues that I've got a problem with, it just came out in the Wall Street Journal last week, was the amount of money they're spending on armed agents.
Gentleman's
about
time has
$11 million.
expired.
I yield back.
Mr. Johnson's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the panel for being with us today. Gentlemen, you know, the flat level of funding that typically would occur under a CR is what's supposed to provide Congress an incentive to pass regular appropriations bills at higher levels. And CRs are usually set at either the prior year's level or the lower of the House and Senate levels for the budget year. And CRs can also be set at alternative levels as well. Some have suggested that to both reverse the bias toward higher spending and to ensure there is not an end-of-year lapse in appropriation, that Congress should adopt a law providing for an automatic continuing resolution, an automatic CR that would gradually ratchet down appropriations from the prior year's levels the longer Congress and the President fail to enact the regular appropriations bills after the start of the fiscal year. And we'll go right down the line, starting with you, Mr. Hoagland. What is your view on an automatic CR process?
My first response is, Congressman, is that I would hope that we could pass the appropriation bills and not rely upon continuing resolutions. But if you had to rely upon continuing resolutions, my preference, to be honest, Congressman, it would be to have the continuing resolution at last year's level, but not to kick it down. That may create the disincentive for Congress ever to act if they want to reduce spending in this country, and they've just basically put us on an automatic downward path.
Mr. Kogan?
I agree, basically. I'd also like to point out that if the creation of these as automatic CRs means that discretionary appropriations would become mandatory appropriations, they would be like every other capped entitlement. The cap would be falling or the cap would be straight, but either way, there'd be no need to pass any appropriations bills ever if 41 senators said they preferred the status quo.
Okay, all right. How about you, Mr. Anderson?
I testified earlier about the importance of incentives, and I mentioned that I think caps provide important incentives. And the plus of caps relative to an automatic CR is that those caps are decided by the Congress, put into law, and with the agreement of the President. I think that is a sufficient incentive to get to where you want to go. You may not do it on the 1st of October. It may take a month or two or something after that, but I think that's an efficient incentive. And I worry about what the implications are of an automatic CR.
You talk about the implications. I might ask all three of you, do you think an automatic CR process could be gamed by one side or the other? I mean, it seems to me that it's fraught with pitfalls. Mr. Hoagland?
I think an automatic CR at last year's level would put everybody in an even keel. I don't think that they
No, I mean if you started ratcheting it.
If you start ratcheting down, I do think you create an incentive for there not to be action.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay. You know, some, going back to Mr. McClintock's line of questioning on unauthorized appropriation, some who have recently testified before this committee believe that Congress has served notice that will no longer provide appropriations to unfunded programs at a date certain, and that after that date, it should altogether defund unauthorized programs. Others, including members of this committee, believe that it is unlikely Congress would completely cut off funding for unauthorized programs. They instead propose gradually reducing the maximum level of appropriations permitted for unauthorized programs, for example, 90% in the first year, 80% in the second, and so on. What is your view, gentlemen, of this step-down approach to handling unauthorized appropriations? Mr. Hoagland?
This is the first time I've heard of that particular proposal, Congressman Johnson. That's an interesting proposal. I do think that we have something like $300 billion in unauthorized appropriations out there. I do think that's something that would have a step down, not eliminated overnight, but a step down would be a good step in the right direction.
Quickly, Mr. Hoagland, Mr. Kogan, I'm sorry.
I think the whole issue of, quote, unauthorized programs is actually based on confusion. Almost all these programs are authorized. The NIH is authorized. The Veterans Department is authorized. NASA is authorized. What is not authorized is the appropriation of money for those programs. And I don't think that that's a big deal. They should appropriate anyhow.
Okay, Mr. Anderson, quickly.
It's sort of a micro way of doing it. I was much more in favor of the macro. Set up what your goal is over a long period of time, set up caps or constraints and a path to get it. The micro, maybe it can help, but the macro I like better.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Dingell, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry I was late to the hearing. We get these multiple hearings all at the same time, but I want you all to know that I've read testimony, and I actually follow your readings because I try to keep myself informed on experts, maybe not agree with them all of the time, but part of being informed as a member of Congress is listening to different ideas. So thank you for being here. But I am concerned about this hearing because I think it's just another attempt to blame the budget process for the failure of Congress to pass the budget. I'll say, like I did 2 weeks ago, the reason the House hasn't passed a budget this year is because of deep differences on policy and the unwillingness to compromise between both sides of the aisle. We're here to discuss how to enforce a budget resolution, yet we do not have a budget resolution to enforce. Many effective tools already exist to change the budget outlook and enforcement, but my Republican colleagues haven't wanted to use them. The main reason we cannot pass a budget resolution this year is because some Republican members don't want to honor or they want to abandon the funding levels agreed to in the Bipartisan Budget Act enacted last year, which our chairman worked very hard on. We enacted fully paid for legislation to improve the budget process by lifting overly austere discretionary limitations. But now some in the Republican caucus want to walk away from this agreement. Why don't we talk about enforcing that budget agreement? The answer is that we're here to discuss budget enforcement in terms of cutting programs for the most vulnerable of Americans while not asking anything of those most able to sacrifice. It's no coincidence that all of the ideas we've discussed in these hearings disproportionately hurt the people who need it the most. We got to work together to address the austerity level discretionary cuts that come back in 2018 if we fail to pass a budget. Passing a budget, let alone enforcing one, is going to require compromise from all members in both parties. We've been sent here by the American people to work on their behalf, and it's time we all come to the negotiating table in good faith and give the people a budget that works for all Americans. Having said that, I have some questions for Mr. Kogan. Given that we cannot pass a budget resolution this year, is it a good idea to reform the budget process in a way that would deliberately create more crisis points?
I don't think that the history of budgeting in crisis illuminates how we should work. I think that budgeting in crisis tends to lead to poorly thought out, last-minute decisions that often cannot be sustained. So creating artificial crises is just not a good idea. I also admit that budgeting not in crisis often leads to the sort of situation we are in now, where the two parties do not agree, where there is no majority for any single plan. This is the reality of American government. It's because of the electorate. If people who are willing to compromise are defeated in primaries, I can understand why it's hard to compromise. Nonetheless, that is our job.
Well, I agree with you, for the record. The issue of senior care is another one very important to me. Our elderly must be confident that we'll take care of them when they need it the most. We've got 10,000 people turning 65 every day. We've got a crisis coming at us that nobody wants to talk about, which is what we do, unfortunately. We don't like to talk about problems. With the aging of our population, is it realistic to believe that the size of government will remain unchanged? And would proposals to cap mandatory programs like Social Security and Medicare have a negative impact on our seniors and on our country?
I think that the caps of mandatory programs set at dollar levels in advance of the multi-years are almost always a bad idea for two reasons. First of all, they will be set too low, in my opinion. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid are good programs that are worth paying for. By definition, the caps say the option of paying for them through higher revenues is off the table. I think that that option should always remain on the table. So for that reason, I'm against caps. But I'm also against caps for other reasons I spelled out in my testimony, which is that aggregate caps in particular destroy the automatic stabilizers, which have done a very good job over the last 70 years in making recessions rarer, shallower, and have therefore helped growth.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Sanford is recognized for 5 minutes.
I guess my question is open-ended. I'm in need of hope, and I mean that in this sense. I was in Congress a while back. I got all excited about Social Security reform. I held umpteen different town hall meetings with a guy named Jose Piñera, who was a finance minister down in Chile, at senior centers up and down the coast, talking about the need for reform. I only got interested in that because you looked at the numbers and you had to do something about entitlements to, in fact, impact the budget. Clinton seemed to express a level of interest in that, and yet the Monica Lewinsky thing happened, and that was the end of that. Bush initially said he was interested in entitlement reform, but then along comes 9/11. That was the end of that. there's always something that ends whatever forward movement might have been springing up. And so you look at the numbers and you go back to this enforcement of a budget idea. It seems to me like this is, I mean, just systemic risk for the American civilization. I mean, Sir Alex Francis Taylor, there's a quote attributed to him. I think it fits. Paul Kennedy's book on the rise and fall of great powers. You can come up with a lot of different folks who've looked at history, and they said that basically civilizations extinguish themselves financially more often than not. And so I think that this is a big, big deal that you're getting at, Mr. Chairman. But one can quickly become disillusioned. You look at the degree which debt deficit government spending is talked about at the presidential campaign level. It's not talked about, even within the Congress, with the exception of hearings like this one. It's just not in vogue right now. And so I guess I'd be curious, are there any other best practices that come to mind in civilizations or nations that have been able to stem the tide of that which normally extinguishes a country? Is there any other history of other countries being able to reverse the course of spending? Just a little bit of hope.
In my testimony, I talk about one, and I'll mention another. The testimony talks about Sweden. Sweden in the 80s ran surpluses and was one of the successes in Europe, but in the 90s suffered a financial crisis even worse than the one that we suffered. They went back and reviewed budget processes. They thought that the process they had led to, in part, their unsustainable fiscal future, and they changed the process dramatically. In particular, what Sweden did is take all of their spending and put it into one of 27 different categories, and then cap each category. They don't have a sequester mechanism. Instead, they have a cabinet mechanism where sort of a look back, where if a area exceeds, then they have a margin which they can use to make up for that, or they look at the other 26 areas to see if they can't make up for it. They have done remarkably successful over the past 20 years. I would also point out that Sweden is part of the European Union, but still has its own currency. So it doesn't have to quite obey by the rules of Frankfurt with respect to the euro. The other one that is worthwhile is the one you mentioned before, Chile. Chile suffered a very difficult situation, and in particular, as you talked about before, they were facing an aging population, and they totally revised their Social Security system. Revised it much more along the lines of a defined contribution plan as opposed to a defined benefit plan. It has worked for years too, although there are elements of the society, mothers who don't work full-time, who say that the Chilean system is not particularly rewarding for them, and the American system might be better. But those are two countries that have suffered very difficult situations and have reviewed their process.
I mean, one could argue that Sweden's I mean, with all due respect to the Swedish population, it's fairly uniform in nature. It's not exactly a diverse population, relatively small in size. Same would be the case with Chile. Is there any history of a major world power being able to reverse the tide of spending?
Not to my knowledge, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Stanford, but I will point out that David Wessel's little book on the budget, when he interviewed Secretary Panetta, Chairman Panetta, before he left office, said there were two ways to resolve this issue. Number one was through a crisis, and I think there will be a crisis, or number two, through leadership. And I think it really comes back to leadership. That is the way you're going to resolve this issue.
The name of the book again is?
I think it was the Red Tide, I believe it was. I'll correct for the record.
I think it was Red Tide, yeah. Gentleman's time has expired. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I think that your testimony and responses to the questions has been truly enlightening, and we appreciate your joining us today. Please be advised that members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions or extraneous material may do so within 7 days. With that, this committee stands adjourned.